I'm RJ McGrail. I'm a senior fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Lincoln's a private operating foundation working globally. We seek to improve the quality of life through effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land, advocating for more just, inclusive, and entrepreneurial ecosystems across the globe. We research and develop tools that support practitioners and communities to develop additive rather than extractive methods to build a more inclusive and resilient economy. Our work's really rooted in the belief that land and its inherent value must be better positioned for community-wide benefit, reaching across the community development ecosystem, informing, influencing, and improving the ways this system helps people and communities create more broadly shared opportunities. The conversation that we're going to have today is going to be about both tools and strategies. And so I'm going to introduce folks in a minute, but I want to start with tools and have my colleague Randa Chano-Murray from our Center for Geospatial Solutions do a demo of a new data tool that the Lincoln Institute has developed on land ownership.
All right, can everyone, yes, I think you can hear me. All right, thanks so much, RJ, and thank you all for coming here today. As RJ said, I'm Raina. I'm an associate director with the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, and I work specifically out of our Center for Geospatial Solutions. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that our center is doing to support the work that RJ and his partners and colleagues are doing as well. So I'm sure if you do any kind of place-based work, you have seen headlines and articles like this, especially over the last few years. I think we've just seen every day it seems like there's another headline coming out, whether it is about concerns over single-family residential homes being increasingly bought out by corporate investors, pushing out owner-occupied housing, or about concerns over, for example, who owns our timberlands, our agricultural farmlands, our industries, et cetera, and onwards, both just in general or for specifically for specific types of housing, such as mobile home parks, or after, say, a natural disaster, like what happened in Maui. At the center, we, as you can imagine from the name Center for Geospatial Solutions, we are a team of technologists, primarily geospatial technologists. And so we were seeing these headlines and decided we really wanted to be able to really start to answer the questions that these headlines are trying to get to, which are questions such as, who owns the properties in my city? You know, what proportion of mobile home parks are now owned by out-of-state corporate investors, and what impact does that have on residents in terms of their rents, in terms of the affordability of that place? Where are the religious-owned properties in my state? This was in regard to California recently passed a legislation called Yes in God's Backyard that attempts to ease the zoning and permitting requirements for place-based organizations to essentially build affordable housing on surplus land that they own. So what are the potential impacts of a YIGBY-like law in my state, essentially? How have ownership trends changed over time for single-family residential homes in my area? What are the tax implications of, say, a growing proportion of out-of-state owners on a place? So these are the types of questions that we were interested in answering, and we came up with a methodology and an analysis called Who Owns America, where we are using parcel-level data and through a variety of data standardizations, cleaning, and aggregations and integrations of additional information, none of which I will go into here because I do not want to bore all of you, but if you're interested in learning about the methodology, please reach out to me later. We essentially have been working to classify parcels at each and every parcel across the country in terms of their ownership type. This is regardless of industry, regardless of whether that property or that particular parcel is residential, commercial, et cetera. And so that allows us to, for example, put together some baseline analyses and stats. I like to call this a snapshot in time. What we're really doing is we have produced a methodology that allows us to run this national classification so that we can get a better sense of the types of property ownership that exist across the country. I'm just showing you California right now, showing you the total number of parcels that we have, as well as the classification types. So within government, we look at whether it's federally owned, state-owned, locally owned, or other, meaning that we weren't able to quite classify based on the information we found. Owner-occupied, whether it is whether we truly believe it is owner-occupied, or we do have a smaller subset for likely owner-occupied, where there's just a little bit of nuances in that data, as well as also corporate ownership, where we really want to look at not only whether or not that corporate owner is based in-state or out-of-state, but also the extent of their portfolio size. Is this a corporate investor who owns one property in your area, or is this a corporate investor who owns multiple, whether that be 20 or 100? One of the really exciting things is we're also now integrating corporate entity registration data so that we can better understand and see the linkages between subsidiaries and branches, since we all know oftentimes it's not like you're going to be able to see the true ownership of corporate land is often hidden through subsidiary chains, et cetera, and onwards. And so by actually bringing in and integrating information regarding these relationships, we're able to better understand the connections between parcels in an area. And non-corporate ownership is sort of our catch-all bucket. If it doesn't fall into a corporate ownership bucket, owner-occupied, government, it falls into our non-corporate ownership. So this is where we get a lot of our nonprofits, our educational institutions, hospitals, as well as also perhaps landlords who haven't formalized their rental businesses under an LLC, or folks with second homes, third homes, et cetera. So with this information, what we try to do, and I do apologize, it looks like the data set is having a bit of a hard time loading here, but what I've pre-done here is we work with different partners across the country on their, to help them with understanding what's happening in their particular area. We're working with Salt Lake County right now, where they are interested in understanding the impacts of corporate ownership on their residential housing market. So what I've done here is, after we ran our classification, we added a lot of additional information, and we created this web-based application so that our partner can really query and filter the information to get to answer the types of questions they're interested in. So in this case, I'm looking at where our ownership classification changed from 2018 to 2023, where it is a residential or multi-housing parcel. We're looking specifically at parcels that are essentially classified now as out-of-state corporate owned. And then we are looking specifically at parcels within that also, whoops, having fun with the mouse here, parcels that fall into a disadvantaged census tract. A census tract that's essentially been identified as disadvantaged via the Justice 40 program. By providing these types of queries and filters, our partners are able to see exactly how many parcels fall into their specific parameters that they're interested in looking at. We see that that's about a total of 313 parcels with about 4,220 housing units. And in this case, it was interesting. We also took a look at the ownership breakdown via school districts and council districts. And Salt Lake County is an area where you're seeing a tremendous amount of population growth, a lot of housing, a lot of new development being built, but overall, with the exception of one school district, a decrease in that residential parcels of owner-occupied housing, and an increase in that corporate ownership. So, for us, we think that it's really important to be able to get these types of data sets cleaned, aggregated, and readily available to partners who are trying to better understand the context of how things are changing in their particular study area. It's an important part of any type of place-based work. Just another example, we had the opportunity to work with some partners in Maui following the devastating wildfires that happened a few years ago. And one of the questions was, that the county was trying to understand was, what is the potential impact of this fire long-term on, short-term on their tax revenue, and what's the shortfall going to be, and what will it mean then in terms of owners who may be vulnerable and be feeling pressure to sell their homes? What will that mean in the future in terms of the housing stock and the number of residents who can continue to live in Lahaina in owner-occupied homes? So the first thing first is to be able to just understand the extent of the problem. What we did here was we built an application where we have the information regarding, right now I've pre-selected this, so we're looking at owner-occupied housing, where the assessed value is at most $700,000, which coming from Baltimore feels like a lot, but in Maui, that's not a lot. It's just the fact. So we're looking at the properties that were damaged by the fire that are owner-occupied with probably the lowest valued homes. So looking at folks who are in many ways can be considered the most vulnerable following the impacts of the fire. And we see that there was a total of 409 properties with about $197,000 in total property tax revenue being represented by those 409 properties, with a fairly high assessed value of $226.7 million. With this one of the other fun things that we added was we pulled all of the different tax class information and tax rates information to be able to start doing some scenario planning with our partners of, well, if you want to try to, if you want to try to find ways to forgive and make up, oh, sorry, I am not used to this trackpad. I'm usually a Mac user, so this is fun. If you want to try to find ways to make up that loss in revenue of $197,000, where might you do some changes to the tax rate, whether to say commercialized residential or hotel resort, timeshares, long-term rentals? Can you change the tax rate around and see what that what a change in, say, from $5 for long-term tier 2 long-term residential from $5 to $5.5, not 55. That would be insane. Will do regarding making up some of your loss in tax revenue. So we see this again as we see data and tools as a way to support the types of work that my colleagues up here on the stage today will be talking about. But thank you. RJ, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Raina. These are tools for municipalities. These are tools for communities. Part of the reason that we decided to do this session in partnership with SOCAP is that these are tools for allocators who are mission and values aligned to help you make better diligence choices, to help you make better decisions that can affirmatively track to impacting the people and populations that you care about having your investment affect the lives of and the stories of. So we wanted to do that quick demo to sort of provide context to a broader conversation about tools and strategies. And I wanted to start with a question for all three of our colleagues and friends here. Devin Culbertson from the Grounded Solutions Network, who leads their innovative finance team, and Pierre Joseph from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, who leads their inclusive economies portfolio at the bank. I'll let them tell you more about that. Devin and Pierre are both participants in our not accidental choice of title for the session, which is Lincoln's Accelerating Community Investment Initiative. We're working all around the country on the sell side of the muni markets largely as the entry point. So we've been working with municipal debt issuers of one form or another around the country for the last 3.5, 4 years now, helping them figure out how to talk capital with each other first, and then helping them figure out how to talk capital with capital in the room in a productive early stage way. I do, as we all do a lot of the impact capital conferences, including this one. And allocators and impact investors, I feel like, love to say that they don't want to buy off the shelf and they want to be part of a bespoke solution that can scale. We think that the public finance sector lets you get all of that. So that's why we started with public finance and the ACI initiative. That led us to nonprofits that are producing funds and efforts that Federal Reserve banks are convening to sort of aggregate capital throughout an entire region. So I'm excited to have everybody here share a little bit of their story and perspective as we start the conversation. It is our intent to do some back and forth in the second half of the hour. So get your questions ready. I know the event team is going to help us with that. But with that, we'll get started. And I'd like Devin to start off, and let me make sure I get the question right. Like I was saying, share a bit of your own story. I think it's important. I'm the second generation son of Irish immigrants, and my immigrant experience was different than my parents' immigrant experience was different than that of the ones that more recent immigrants have, and that's shitty, and I want to do something about it. So that's what brought me, values-wise, personally, to this space, working at the intersection of capital and communities. But Devin, and then Pierre, and then Raina, your own story, what brings you to the work, and then if you could share a little bit about what you're working on today that's aligned towards impact across capital types, across asset holder types, across allocator types, and share a little bit of your story.
Okay, this on? We're good? Yeah, even with the prep, that's a lot of questions. So I'll get at some of those. You know, so my story, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood that was kind of multiracial, but a lot of low-income people, a lot of low-income immigrants. Some of them figured out ways to buy homes. Some of them struggled with that and would start small businesses and gig where they could. That was in Portland, Oregon in the early 90s. Those who figured out a way to buy a home did very, very well financially, and those that didn't were pushed out of their businesses, right, or pushed out of their commercial properties. So that kind of teed up my interest in what I want to spend my career doing. And so I started off in studying sociology, studying planning, thinking that land use could save the world. There's a little bit of that still, but really continue to follow sort of what I saw as the clear sources of power, both regulatory power, financial power, who had the power over places and the power over communities. And that seemed to be the folks who controlled the properties and the folks that could bring capital to those properties. So I spent several years as a developer, single-family, multifamily, land development. Ended up at Enterprise Community Partners as a underwriter on the LIHTC team. So spent time doing equity investment, doing CDFI fund creation, and so I spent a lot of time sort of understanding kind of where the levers were as best that I could discern them systemically. And then the last part of my career at Enterprise, spent a lot of time working with community-based organizations that were engaging with their communities and starting with the question of, what do you want? What do you want to see in your place? And supporting them meant trying to figure out this arc from what do you want in your place to what is investable. And every one of those deals was 100% unique. Every one of those deals had 15 different opinions in them, and then were branded as speaking for community as a monolith. And they struggled. This was 2021. If there was ever a time for community ownership that prioritized racial equity to be able to move forward, that was it, and they still struggled. And so in this last phase of my career, next phase of my career, I guess not last, probably, I'm at Grounded Solutions Network, and so we are a national organization. We have about 250 members. The bulk of them are land trusts, but all those members are really thinking about housing with lasting affordability and really focused on wealth creation. And in doing that, we have focused on, rather than what are folks saying that they want, understanding what works. So we've really started to look deeply at the private equity space, and particularly around single-family rentals, and understanding sort of what those investments have sort of opened, unlocked, disrupted in the single-family space, and where that infrastructure, that wealth creation infrastructure, that servicing infrastructure is available to impact capital in ways that will ultimately accrue to community benefit. So that's my work today.
Let's make sure this is on. So hello, my name is Pierre Joseph. Just to give a bit of a disclaimer, my views are my own and don't necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve System nor the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Now getting that out of the way, I am a child of the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, the birthplace of basketball. It's a small city in Western Mass. I'm also a bit of a creature of government. I've worked for 2 U.S. senators, spent some time in the Obama White House. My candidate then lost in 2016. I was like, oh shit, I don't want to do this anymore. And then I joined philanthropy, where I worked at the Solidago Foundation for a number of years, building a national inclusive economies portfolio, working with organizing groups coming out of the Great Recession. They're really trying to think through how to organize capital in new ways in order to achieve community ends. And we worked with communities like the Boston Ujima Project, the Real People's Fund out in the Bay Area, helped design $10 million community-controlled capital funds in order to help direct capital towards community projects. And I did that for a while, but under a living donor at a foundation, and like, yo, living donors are super problematic. Their decisions change on a whim, and I'm like, yo, dude decided he didn't want to support the work anymore, and I'm like, okay, bet. I will create my own consulting group where I continue to support community-based organizations until the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston said, hey, Pierre, we're looking to do a new line of work around building inclusive economies. The gig is basically yours if you want this. I've spent the past 12 years really trying to think through how to democratize finance in ways that work with communities, and it led me to the bank. And quickly on the bank, when folks think about the Federal Reserve System, you probably think about setting interest rates. But we also have this really unique role in the community development space, which is really around how do we connect with communities and really understand how capital is flowing or not flowing within places. And what my role has been really over the past 2 years or so is really trying to think through how do we, in this really unique moment in time where there's just more money at stake, looking at the American Rescue Plan dollars, some of the climate dollars that are flowing through, there's a lot more money at stake, and communities are having this burning question: how do we make better decisions given the resources that are available? The key challenge that we've seen in our smaller cities is that the dollars aren't flowing. These are places that have been historically disinvested in, and it's going to take organizing capital in new ways in order to make a difference. So my role at the Fed is working with communities across New England, also a national and place-based advisory group that we've developed in order to think through new models, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but new models that get capital to flow to places where historically doesn't flow but should. That's the work.
Awesome. All right. So as I said earlier, I'm Raina, and I came to this because, so I'm a third culture kid, Japanese citizen, raised kind of all over the place, but a lot of formative times in Philadelphia and then random suburbs in New Jersey. Quite a disconnect between the two places, quite frankly. And so because of that, I think for me, coming to place-based work, I almost approached it as an anthropologist, where having been someone who was raised moving around every 2-3 years, I think I saw a couple people nod when I said third culture kids, so maybe a few people can relate. You may struggle sometimes to have a good sense of grounding and a sense of place. So for me, I was drawn to the work because I was very curious and interested in understanding that better. Intentionally settled in Baltimore and have really worked to root myself and ground myself there. I came to this work because my original career was in international development, doing a lot of vocational skills training related work. And every time we were writing grants, GIS would be used for grant writing to have a better understanding of the location in terms of the environment. So environmental factors, whether that be the weather, whether that be topography, et cetera and onwards, economic factors. But so often, some of the more harder to quantify aspects, so community input, those were never quantified or converted into something that could be used and looked at together with these other very quantitative factors that unfortunately I do think get prioritized by funders when trying to assess and understand whether or not they will fund a project. So I was drawn to GIS because I was interested in participatory GIS work and how can you take more qualitative components that reflect community input and perspectives around what's important to them and what's not, and turn those into something that can be used more. Basically, my philosophy was the certain authoritative layers will always be, those are the fallbacks that everyone will look at and assess situations on, rather than having certain inputs be isolated and siloed, and in Word documents as testimonies, et cetera. Can we find ways to better integrate that to make sure that they are being considered equally alongside other quantitative factors? So that led me to GIS work, and then now with my GIS work, I try to always keep that in mind as I'm doing my analyses and work. So yeah, that's how I came to it.
Thank you. I was struck by I want to pull the thread on sort of the theme of democratization of finance plus, let's call it plus. Finance, data, tools, the relationship capital that a national network brings to an allocator trying to find their way to investment in a place. That means a lot of things to a lot of people. It can mean democratization of access to capital. It can mean democratization of how demand is organized in a place that meets community need. It can mean democratization of how the buy side is organized and brought to the table in new and interesting ways. I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation about promising strategies or tools in your work or that you've seen that can help an audience of allocators think through, like, what are the kind of things that our allocator colleagues in the room should be thinking about in terms of democratization of access to the opportunities of the financial system in one form or another?
Who do you want to start?
You were nodding the most, so I'm going to have you start.
I'm happy to start. So on a fundamental level, I think capital is organized in a couple different ways. One, you've got like large national capital flows, and those large entities decide where they want to invest. You also have place-based capital flows that tend to be made up of community foundations, corporates within a particular region, and place-based philanthropy. The challenge, at least in the communities that I work in, that tends to be smaller cities and rural communities, is that they don't have access to capital in the ways that cities like Boston do. There's just a lot more wealth. So like, what do you do in the absence of wealth? Capital has to be organized differently. When I was doing some work with the New Mexico Impact Investing Collaborative, as an example, that was an instance where you've got a relatively poor state, not much philanthropy, not much on the corporate side. And what those investors did is they banded together and created an impact investing collaborative, paid for the shared cost of due diligence, launched a now $44 million fixed income fund in order to help have a different conversation with allocators around what does it actually mean to invest in place. And in addition to that, they're also at this point in time really trying to develop new innovative place-based strategies where instead of using a clearinghouse going deal by deal, they're thinking through how do we organize capital together in the form of a fund in order to invest within place. I've taken these learnings as I've been thinking through my role at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston as we're thinking through solving this similar challenge. Like, how do you organize capital in new ways that work for small cities and rural areas? For us, what we've been thinking through is designing a regional fund, recognizing that historically what happens in our 6-state region is states are competing against each other for resources. But how can we organize capital in new ways through a fund that's doing a couple of things? One, investing in a couple key critical areas that communities have said they need. So naturally occurring affordable housing, small business, also thinking through climate solutions with the greenhouse gas reduction fund money that's available. And the goal is to bring both place-based investors together with national investors in order to organize capital in a new form. And we're hoping to do two things. One, invest in existing lenders within a region who need more help. When you talk to a lot of community development financial institutions and other lenders, there's a lot of restrictions that are put on their capital. So even if there's all this great community need, the type of capital that's available oftentimes can't solve the challenges that communities face. Communities say they need broader, patient, more flexible forms of capital. So this fund could be investing in some of those CDFIs and other leaders that are trying to inch out on the risk curve and support communities in new ways. The other thing that's needed is investing in deals that otherwise wouldn't be financed. And that is a role that this fund will hopefully play in the New England region. And like, why does this matter? One of the fundamental challenges on the community side is like, philanthropy can spend all this money encouraging communities to vision. Oftentimes that happens, but if true dollars, investment dollars, don't show up to actually invest in projects, all that visioning doesn't matter. Because I think it's one thing to like have that conversation on what community can be. It's another thing for investment capital to show up. So I think what we're hoping to do is to really try and bridge the gap between really great ideas that are happening within communities and also this need from the investor side for deals that can be diligenced. Oftentimes what's missing on the community side is like, you have a great vision, a great idea, but it can't pass the due diligence process. So more work can be done in order to help communities level up and realize that this work requires more than just grants if you want to achieve transformation within communities.
Devin?
I really like that frame about sort of how you think about deals that aren't being done and how to bring capital to them. And I think that, and I wonder sort of for the allocators in the room, how they think about the deals that aren't being done and sort of what's beyond kind of their product line or their sleeve that gets triaged out, and what things they wish they could find, what things they are here looking for at SOCAP, what kind of deals they want to be able to invest and have be investment and diligence ready that aren't quite there. And I think that there's a path to that through thinking about those deals that aren't being done and bringing capital to that. I think there's also, the frame that we take is what deals are being done but could be done differently. could be done by different owners, where the decision making could be in a different place. And so with our fund, we're looking at using that infrastructure of single family rental that's really built for private equity, which is particularly around quick acquisition, which is around portfolio aggregation, cost-effective rehab, really efficient operations for the long term, and sort of repurposing that. So we'll talk more about the community voice part in a minute, but part of what we're doing is saying, okay, let's secure this opportunity and bring to you, our community partners, you, our land trust members, an opportunity as a starting place to say, where can we take this? We have an infrastructure that works. We have a deal that can return capital. It works in your place. Now, how do we riff on this and make this something more impactful and go a little bit deeper? And so I think that there's sort of multiple ways to get there, but it requires sort of thinking sort of a little bit beyond sort of what's getting done, where the product dimensions are. And I think part of that is thinking less about product and more about partnership. You know, capital flows as much through relationships as it does through diligence, right? Like there's always sort of kind of an informal and assumptive piece of that. And so I think that really understanding where there's a partnership lens to that, to be really upfront and say, like, this doesn't work because it's off by this. Here's the gap. Here's where it doesn't meet my terms. Here's what you could do for me to accept that guarantee. And so I think that that's a little bit of a longer term thing, right? Might not be a deal this quarter or this year. That might be the deal that you invest in 2 years from now. But I think that there's a little bit of there's going to have to be a curve for this stuff to pick up, and I think that's part of like the different way of thinking about it.
I think I'd be curious, Randy, you talked a bunch during the demo about government partnerships. I know that the center has also been the partner of more traditional funders, grant makers, individuals, community groups. How does that happen? How does somebody that's not in the public finance or municipal space that finds their way to CGS through a relationship with a Lincoln Institute program area or a research effort, like how does CGS seek out its partners and clients and relationships that help you advance this type of work?
Yeah, I mean, so a few things I should have mentioned. The center is quite young. We were started back in 2020, so we are the youngest center at Lincoln. So I would say we've been really operating under the radar for a long time and mostly relying on word of mouth and through our Lincoln partners to help refer potential partners to us. The Maui work that I showed was actually in partnership with a small nonprofit group called Maui ESG. They asked us to do the analysis so that and essentially took the findings that they were able to glean from using our application to then go and talk to the council board during various meetings that were being held regarding what to do following the fires. What we try to do with our work is we try to really think about what are the types of questions and problems that folks have that are pressing, and how can we set up our analyses in such a way that it's easy for us to scale them, because as we know, doing these types of analyses, they can be costly, and it's a cost for a lot of smaller partners to have to consider. If we can automate as much of this as possible, make it so that it can be run fairly quickly, that lowers the cost point, like the cost and the investment requirement for partners to then work with us, and they can focus more on thinking about what they do with the analysis, with the results. So that's something that we really try to work on, and we see ourselves as like I think the term we use is non-profit geospatial partner. So really our mission is trying to provide geospatial solutions and support to organizations and groups that historically may have not necessarily have had access to a lot of these types of analyses or tools. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the tools, strategies at a conversation at a conference whose main organizing theme is systems change, I'd like to move us to systems change and strategies about how we get there. The global financial system doesn't work for a lot of the people and the places that we seek to deploy capital into. And it doesn't work because it was designed not to work for those places, because it was designed by designers to work in a certain way to maximize their benefit and return. So the question to tee up for the room here in a few minutes and sort of a closing question is, when you're trying to build a new or influence the corners of the financial system to build a new economic construct, what are some of the things besides, right? We've talked about deal flow, we've talked about aggregating capital, we've talked about organizing demand. What else drives authentic investment in places? How do you ensure that the investment, how do you ensure that the investment is truly rooted in some sense of community need and priorities? Like, what are the tools and strategies that you all use in achieving that?
So yeah, there's two pieces in that I want to pick up on. That the last one, I think, is really this question about what does it mean to be kind of a different kind of intermediary, a different kind of fund manager, respond in a different way. And I think as a member organization, that's particularly interesting for us, because we know for the most part who our clients and who our local partners will be. And so that's really a matter of being able to sort of respond to what they've asked of us, to say we are tapped out with our local NOFAs. We're not getting more from our city government to do this work. We need you as the national organization to start working on a better mousetrap. And when you've got some ideas, come back and talk to us. And so that's exactly what we've done over the last few years. And now when we do have those opportunities, whether they be off market or on market, we've got something under contract, we're able to go with them and say, let's get in the car. Let's go drive and look at these properties. Does this sort of fit with what you're looking for? Or, we've noticed in the case of this portfolio we just acquired in Minneapolis, we've noticed 25% of this is right in one neighborhood. Let's start talking to the community-based organizations in that neighborhood and understand what it means for the education outcomes and for some of the other things that are important to folks in place. So I think there's a way to play that intermediary role to aggregate capital into more investable scales, but do it in a way that leans a little bit more heavily on the community connection and the support to the folks on the ground. The other thing that I want to touch on about systems change, I think that there's the system that's offered and there's a system that exists, right? And so a lot of what we're looking at is, how do we start the work that we're doing, and how do we move to other kinds of capital and other kinds of relationships and other scales that are fundamentally exist in our capitalist system but aren't on offer to us today, right? And so that's an evolution from what does it look like to work with CDFI capital to CRA bank capital to ultimately get to municipal issuances for bond capital, right? All part of our existing system. It's just what pieces we're able to connect and when. And so there's kind of a scale curve that we're looking to navigate to be able to make this work impactful for communities and at the right scale for investors, without even necessarily having to sort of create anything entirely new. It's just which dots we connect on the map.
I will +1 that on the what dots to connect to the map. I think at the community level, what's needed is a bit of a reckoning. I think in many ways, philanthropy is not honest about what it can and cannot do. Many times they're quick to say, we will fund you on the grant making side, and they will never show up on the investment side. In many ways, I think there needs to be a broader understanding at the community level around, the tools of philanthropy, both the grant-making tools and the investment tools, but also a broader conversation around the capital continuum, from grants and PRIs to fixed income to, again, the municipal issuances, because this is all the toolbox of community development. But what we've done is we've siloed off folks who work on municipal finance, folks who are doing the community work, folks that are in PRI and sometimes the market space. But what's needed is really trying to partner with groups at the community level to better understand what that full vision is in a place and the different types of capital that are needed to make that vision a possibility. And it requires, I think, a different type of organizing amongst investors. It requires, I think, a very different conversation at the community level with organizers, community-based organizations, CDCs, CDFIs, around how do we all better understand what it is a community needs, and then the type of capital that's required in order to get there, and be honest about it. Because I think right now we're not having an honest conversation around what it takes to transform a place. But we can get there. And that's kind of the role of the different Federal Reserve banks, at least Boston, Atlanta, Philly, Dallas, a little bit in San Francisco. Folks are leaning in, but we're allies on the research side, but also the engagement side too.
I'll say I'm going to talk about two things. So on the data side, I think it is extremely important to make sure all partners have access to reliable, standardized, regularly updated data, so that everyone can, and that essentially creates not only it provides that baseline, it also makes sure you're all evaluating things in the same way. It's an apples to apples comparison, not an apples to oranges, and for us at CGS, that's one of our focus areas: is how can we make sure we are capturing in our parcel data all the different potential uses, and make sure it's something that could be used for all partners involved in a particular project. The other thing too is then thinking through on the tools side of things in terms of applications and what you build using that data. I think this kind of ties a little bit to what you were talking about, but I think I'm just going to use an example of what we've done. So, I think a lot of times what you end up with is you have, again, unequal ways that folks can contribute information. Oftentimes, I used to do work in urban planning and historic preservation, so oftentimes community engagement happens with a print map of showing some research and results, maybe asking people to mark or note some points or something on it. And that's the only way that community engagement happens. It's the only way it's captured. It's not, and then there's no follow-through necessarily on how that data is shared and then also integrated back into other information that's being used to assess projects. There are a lot of increasingly great tools out there, and I don't believe in data or technology for their own sake. I believe that they should have some social impact. That can be leveraged and used to make sure that there's greater transparency, so that everyone has access to those tools, everyone is able to use it. There's ways to make sure that folks have, are able to access it, able to use it, able to also provide input back in, and having your information and your communication very clearly laid out there, I think, lends itself to greater transparency, which is also extremely important.
Thank you. I think question cards are out, but while they're being collected and brought up here, so we can shift to some questions from the group, a really quick 1-minute popcorn style. The work that's been described, our Accelerating Community Investment Initiative at Lincoln is doing this in New England, and Pierre and a bunch of colleagues from the public side in New England are partners. We're doing it in Texas, where Devin's based. That's how I met Devin, was through an effort that we were doing with the Austin Economic Development Corporation and the state HFA and a couple of other debt issuers and a couple of other regional housing players. I think before you were even at GSN, right? Were you still working at Enterprise when we met each other? I think we may have been.
Yeah, right at the
Yeah. So it's this national network of community members, of issuers, of partners, and increasingly of local, regional, and national allocators. We designed the program in a way to spend a bunch of time getting our own collective understanding, doing the skill building required to have a community organizer from the People's Assembly in Jackson, Mississippi, along with the chairman of the redevelopment authority that the mayor appointed, along with the Mississippi Home Corporation, the state HFA, understand how to talk to each other. It just doesn't always happen in place. And frankly, understand how to organize themselves to interact with capital in useful ways and with allocators in useful ways. So as we collect questions, the quick 1-minute popcorn to buy a little time and get a little bit more value out of the panel is, as participants and as colleagues and partners in this work, what about that construct that we've built at Lincoln was interesting to you, and what about it should we be telling the world about as we wrap up our portion of the conversation?
Is this thing on? So as both a participant and now an ACI advisor. I think what was attractive for me when I was doing work in New Mexico with a range of place-based foundations is opportunities to connect with national allocators and also a range of housing finance agencies and economic development agencies to really understand what's happening in other places around the country. I think having that online community and also investor challenges was just a great way in order to connect and see what's possible. I think now on the advisor side, it's just really great seeing the good work that's happening in places like Jackson, the good work that's happening in New Mexico, the great work in Georgia, and also work to be started in the New England region as folks really come together across silos to better understand how can we be more responsive to community, but also get investment flowing to places that need it.
Yeah, and from my perspective, credit where credit's due, the place where we started thinking about what does this trajectory look like and how do we connect the right dots for this work was at the ACI in Austin, right? We started saying, like, sort of understanding, well, I can look and see what a 10-year muni yield is, but how do I get that cost of capital? What's the threshold? And what are the formal and informal gates that I'm going to have to navigate? And being able to talk to folks and understand that they're doing private placements at $10 million, right? That it's not, I don't need to put out a $400 million bond to be able to access that kind of capital. So it was really interesting to sort of be able to sort of work with folks who are trying and test fitting a lot of that stuff and understand kind of what those incremental steps start to look like, to really get a much clearer sense of the trajectory of the effort that we're working on.
I think it's extremely important to have places where you can have just honest and tough conversations and to have it with a variety of different partners and types and learn from each other. And so Lincoln's programs, especially ACI, I think offers opportunities for that. And so for me, as someone who's more on the data and tools side, it is extremely invaluable to hear what folks are trying to do, hear also some of the debates that happen at those talks. And for me, what I'm always looking to try to take away is what is the pressing need that a data set or a tool can help answer for our partners.
So as we're getting a little more conversational, I can respond to that. One of the tough conversation piece is really interesting because I came out of Austin with a lot of great ideas and went to the next session and had some side conversations and had lunch with some folks and it's like, yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to these are kind of the ways I'm thinking about this or that, and be able to hear folks say like, oh yeah, no, I tried that. Like, here's why it didn't work, or here's the roadblock that I hit, or here's where here's the hard truth, right? Here's like how hard the road's going to be. So it's not just kind of what the opportunities and great ideas are, but to kind of like steel yourself because this is good, for the road you're going to have to walk if you want to get it done. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to go with a question for right now, talking about corporate ownership of land. What are some strategies that you've seen or heard of for place-based investors to build past that ownership with having a hard time? Am I mangling somebody's question that I can hand the mic to because I'm having a hard time with your penmanship?
Half your question, shout it out.
Sorry about that.
That's a great question. Thank you. And I unfortunately don't have a great answer. I think we're still trying to see where there's good examples. I think for us, one of the first things for me is just always whenever folks come to us with a question or an assumption about we think this is happening in our community or we've heard stories. Our first thing is, well, with any type of place-based work, we need to first understand the full extent of this problem. Like how widespread is this? We are seeing, especially, we've been doing a lot of work in Salt Lake County recently. We are seeing a lot of just an increase in in corporate investor activity. They're more for single-family homes. For mobile homes, we have talked to different groups, especially in Arizona now, actually. And there hasn't been, I think folks are still grappling with just fully understanding the extent of the issue. And we're seeing a lot more, we're seeing some partners do some promising work around organizing and making sure tenants understand their rights and advocate. And on our end, what we've supported and helped with is helping tenant organizers identify likely recent corporate acquired mobile home parks or other types of residential housing, so that they could then do targeted outreach to those communities with mailings, with phone calls to make sure folks understood what their rights were, help folks connect to other resources. So we've seen engagement like that, but it's still fairly early stages. So it's something we're interested in tracking and following in the future.
Okay. There's a question here that I want to make sure that we try to at least offer some perspective on and answer. The answers I'll acknowledge on the front are going to be incomplete, but I do want to follow up on them. The question relates to the notion of ownership in indigenous communities and the notion of land ownership in indigenous communities, and this absurd systemic, in the financial sector, this absurd notion that this land is owned by anybody. In our system, in the way that we approach financing in this country, I think there are some lessons in the shared equity movement, which is why I handed the card to Devin to sort of also offer some perspective here. But we have been increasingly, more broadly at Lincoln, we are the fiscal sponsor, I guess is how you describe it, for an effort in the Colorado River Basin called the Water and Tribes Initiative, where we talk specifically about water rights ownership and how tribes can collectively interface with the systems that claim ownership of that water resource. So there's those types of examples, but I'm curious if there are lessons from the Anglo-Western U.S. shared equity movement or shared equity ownership movement that could help on a question like this.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, all of them partial answers to the question. So I think a few things. In the shared equity space, I think a lot of the conversations we have are about kind of what the benefits of ownership are expected to be, what they ought to be, what the hazards of ownership might be, and what to expect there, and how those ought to be shared between individual and community. There's a lot of recency bias in what it means to be a single-family homeowner in a city in this country based on what's happened the last 20 years, right? Based on what's happened the last 10 years, right? Folks forget 2008, 2009, when there was some real downside risk to home ownership, particularly if you didn't have somebody kind of vetting some of the loan options put in front of you, right? And so I think that and all of those conversations have a cultural current in them, right? When we start talking about community land trusts, a lot of black communities that have seen contract buying, that have seen some of these predatory schemes, they're like, why are you trying to sell me half a house? Why are you here? What's the story? What's in it for you, right? So I think that all those conversations have to be kind of slow and incremental, but ultimately the big question is like, what does it mean to have control over the place where you sleep, right? Over your land, over your house, right? And so I think that there's some wealth building conversations, whether that's any at all, whether that's some kind of a split. But I think that you have to sort of look at that classic bundle of sticks and start to talk about what's the fair compromise, and that's community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood. It's part of why Grounded Solutions does not have a formula or a requirement for how you set up your trust. Like that is for community folks to participate. The other thing I'll say though is that there are some ways that, even given some of the tribal ownership structures, there's ways to access some of the financial system that's not set up for that, when I was at Enterprise, we did do a couple of low-income housing tax credit investments on tribal land. So there's different ways to sort of pull different kinds of resources in to create better quality housing, and some different things that you might be able to unlock, even if that ownership piece is not super traditional.
We have time for one more, and we have one more audience question, so I think it's perfect. What is the role that municipal or other government plays in unlocking and facilitating access to institutional capital in place? You know, the question goes on, what are the specific functions, departments, agencies, like who should the audience be seeking out? I can say in the 18 states in New England, you can come to us. In the 18 states in the ACI cohort, I can get you that answer about who the early stage adopters of thinking differently about municipal or other issuances, if you want to think about that type of institutional grade capital. But who else? You know, what are the, like in unlocking institutional dollars and unlocking institutional capital, what have you seen the role of government being, and who in government oftentimes is doing that? Or frankly, not.
I mean, I think this is
right.
This is a tough question. I think if you're just magically thinking you're going to talk to a municipal government office and get someone that says, I'm going to help unlock capital, that's not going to happen. That's just not how municipal governments are set up. Most of them are trying to backfill positions right now. And I think the better conversation is, how can I, as an allocator, bring together government working with a range of community partners, from your anchor institutions to your local community groups to your universities, and really try and think through again, like, what is the strategy in order to advance community, and what are the different types of capital we need in order to get there? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And on the community side, when you're talking to municipal issuers, they're trying to catch up and understand, like, what is my toolbox in order to advance community interests. So I think there just needs to be a broader conversation amongst a range of stakeholders around what's possible. And then you just got to try some shit, because this hasn't been done before. And I think we all need to be honest about that.
And find your people. There are like-minded folks in all sectors, right? And if you find those folks on the government side that are sort of like process thinkers that are working the long game alongside you and can kind of work the incremental regulations and the NOFA structure and all those things, I think that's part of where the path of success lies, is finding those folks across industries.
And if I can say one more thing, because if you look at the Biden administration and what they tried to do through the State Small Business Credit Initiative, $10 billion going into community, in theory, to help build more broader community investment ecosystems. The minimum that states were receiving was around $50 million. The implementing agencies from most of the states were state economic development agencies. And what did most states do? They spent the bulk of those dollars on setting up state-based venture capital funds, instead of really thinking through, how do we holistically invest in our local community development ecosystems? I think there's going to be tons of learnings from SSBCI around what not to do, and I think that becomes a launching point as we think through future administrations and the role of investors, really think through, what does it mean to organize capital differently? And I think now's the moment in time just to try some shit. So get energized, get excited, find your people, and move.